Hi my friends, my name is Ryan Freeman. Welcome to my life. Welcome to this video. Today I wanted to talk about COVID-19. Now, I have a video that got censored from YouTube because I expressed my opinions very honestly. So I don't want to repeat that. So at the very beginning of this video, I just want to say that I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a science journalist. I am a concerned citizen for the sake of my children's future, and probably like you, I want the best information, not trying to cram the information to some preconceived notion, but figure out what exactly happened and is happening. Is it important to actually find out how it originated? Well, when you make a mistake in your life, it is kind of good to find out how it happened so that you don't repeat it, especially a big mistake. Sometimes we make the same mistake over and over until we learn our lesson. And I think as a society, it would be a great idea to find out if any part of our society is culpable for the origin of COVID-19. So that being said, I think this is a very worthy topic. I read last Friday in Politico that Harvard was coming out with a poll that would be coming out this week, but they already released part of their findings, and it said that 52% of Americans believe that COVID-19 came from a lab, and that what's surprising to the researchers was that it was bipartisan. Sometimes the narrative is believed, one side of the narrative is believed by Democrats and disbelieved by Republicans and vice versa, but it now looks like public opinion has actually shifted, and 59% of Republicans believe that COVID-19 came from a laboratory, 52% of Democrats, and there was a 28% minority of those sampled that said that they still believed it was a zoonotic origin, came from nature, came from an animal. So do we know whether or not COVID-19 came from a laboratory? Will we ever know? The experts that I've listened to, both experts that came from sort of mainstream media and experts that sort of came from independent media, said it's possible that we'll never know. But some experts do feel very confident in at least making a conclusion based on circumstantial evidence that it actually did come from a lab leak. First, let's look at the evidence that it came from a zoonotic origin. There is no evidence. The Chinese government has tested tens of thousands of samples of possible animals where it could have came, and they have come up with zero. One of the reasons it's been so strongly favored by some scientists is that typically in the past, pandemics have started this way. So, when you have a problem, and in the history that problem has occurred because of X, Y, and Z, well, generally that would be the first suspect. But now let's look at the evidence for the lab leak hypothesis. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of evidence. There are much better sources on YouTube and the web to go to, but this is just a list of some things that I think are some pretty strong circumstantial evidence that it might possibly have come from a lab. Let's say former CDC Director Robert Redfield, he had an interview with, I think it was CNN and other news outlets. So he was the former head of the CDC, very authoritative, credible source. Robert Redfield publicly stated that it was his professional opinion that it came from a lab leak. Stanford professor David Relman, who is currently advising the government on the science behind the pandemic, has publicly stated, I got this from a CBS video, that the Wuhan lab housed vast libraries of bat viruses, including specimens from caves that are the closest relatives to the COVID-19 virus. So this Wuhan lab, linked to the lab leak hypothesis, they had vast libraries of bats and bat viruses that included specimens from caves that are the closest relatives to the COVID-19 virus. So wouldn't be surprising if there was a connection there. The lag, and David Relman, the Stanford professor who advises the government on the pandemic science, said the lab was actually collecting samples from nature in the largest number with the greatest diversity of almost any place on the planet. He said the lab leak hypothesis is absolutely legitimate and plausible. So a couple pretty strong scientists throwing their weight behind, at least some signs are pointing towards the lab leak. One thing to consider, the Wuhan laboratory was operating under a biosafety level 2, which the journalist for CBS said that's the equivalent to a dentist office during a procedure. So they were not wearing bubble suits, which would have been bio level safety 4, which doesn't mean that it couldn't have happened under a biosafety level 4, but they had a pretty low level of safety operating with these very dangerous coronaviruses. Another piece of evidence, the U.S. State Department released a fact sheet that said a handful of researchers at the Wuhan laboratory were sick with COVID-19 like symptoms in the fall of 2019 before the Chinese government went public about the virus. So even before we even knew there was a virus called COVID-19, there was a handful of researchers at the Wuhan laboratory that were experiencing COVID-19 like symptoms. And the State Department said that that was very credible, very strong. Do you believe the U.S. State Department? I don't know. Up to you. And there's also, this is kind of crazy, like 2018, there were State Department cables to the main government so there were, in 2018, U.S. government officials actually visited the Wuhan laboratory, and what they saw was very disheartening. They said that there were significant concerns regarding how the Chinese researchers were handling these viruses. They also stated that the lab had a shortage of trained staff, which opened up the possibility of accidents. So this is 2018, way before the U.S. government, when they visited the laboratory, they said, guys, this is a dangerous situation. And unfortunately, I think nothing was done about that. And also, the WHO did send an initial investigation, but from reports, that investigation was severely hampered by the Chinese government. They didn't have direct access to the laboratory. They could only get data through the Chinese scientists. So that's pretty crazy, right? If we want to get down to the bottom of this, we need to have access to the data, and we need to be free and open to discuss it. And I think that it's great that we're finally at a point in time where we can talk about this. Hopefully this video doesn't get censored. Remember, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a research scientist, not a scientist journal of science. But I find this topic very interesting because what are we going to learn from this lesson? Like, let's learn something. And for me, it's the one important consideration is just like there were millions around the world who trusted in the authority of religious institutions like the Catholic Church, and then we found out that, institutions have corruption. Institutions and people within institutions get wayward and people get hurt, such as, the child abuse scandals that we've come to become very familiar with. Then we saw how the Catholic Church didn't really handle that situation very well for the most part initially. I think we have to have the same idea about science. Now, I'm not saying science is a bad thing. I'm thankful for science. I think it's the best instrument we have for understanding so much of the universe. But it does have its limits, and perhaps we should be a little more wary about our scientific investigation and not regard every PhD with a white lab coat as beyond reproach. Scientists are humans too. They also want career advancement. They also take risks. They also want to win Nobel Prizes. They also might do things that might harm us. And I wanted to read a quote. This is going to be the last thing I'm going to read from this clipboard. Apologize for having to look down. This is from Aldous Huxley. He was a very prolific writer in the 20th century, wrote a lot about science, was sort of prophetic about the future of the human race and society. And I think if you read his Brave New World, you'll find quite a lot of similarities in some of the dystopic aspects of his novel and some phenomenon that does actually exist in today's world. So Aldous Huxley, in one of his essays, wrote, "Applied science is a conjurer whose bottomless hat yields impartially the softest of Angora rabbits and the most petrifying of Medusas." So applied science, not theoretical science, but when you're actually using the science, such as in a laboratory, working on these viruses, is a conjurer. Who's a conjurer? A conjurer is a magician who's pulling things out of thin air or out of rabbits. Applied science is a conjurer whose bottomless hat, right? We don't know the limits of science. So the hat of science yields impartially, so it's not good or bad. The softest of Angora rabbits, something that's soft and cuddly and that makes our life nice, and science has certainly done that, and we need to praise science when it has, and that's why I'm not against science. And also the most petrifying of Medusas, right? Science has also brought us modern warfare, nuclear missiles, which we all live under the threat and try to block out of our head. People are talking about the dangers of AI. So applied science is always bringing out both good things and bad things. Science is not good or evil, right? It's a tool. And just like a hammer, you can use that to build a house, fix things. You can also use it to break things, hurt people. Science is a tool that can bring Angora rabbits and the most petrifying of Medusas. So if the lab leak hypothesis does seem to be true, and even if it's not true, it does at least give us a chance to step back and say, okay, maybe we need a lot more oversight on the governments, China, the US, any governments that are funding or allowing this research to continue, and the scientists themselves. And just as the Catholic priests who abused children were hopefully, justice was only served when they were actually punished and held culpable, and the church had an accounting, maybe there needs to be an accounting for anyone who is responsible in extraordinarily dangerous research that leads to the death of millions and millions of people and the destruction of lives in other ways. So that's all I wanted to say. I think I'll probably talk more about this. I think humans as a species, we want authority. Whether we're going to give it to a priest, now we give it to scientists or doctors. We have to remember, you can't just give away your authority without keeping an eye on that authority, whether it's the government or scientists or priests. Otherwise, we'll have terrible things that happen, like what's happened in religious history. And now we're looking at possibly some devastation from the history under the rule of scientific authority. So tell me what you think. My name's Ryan. Thank you for watching this video.